Some mornings, the silence feels so heavy it might crush you. Mabel Crane knew that feeling well as she stood on her ranch porch, watching another piece of her world fall apart. At 55, she'd been fixing things alone for years: broken fences, leaky roofs, and a heart that never quite healed right. When a storm knocked down her back fence, she called for help and got Boone McCready. He was tall, quiet, and gentle in ways that surprised her. He worked without much talking and left coffee by her door each morning. Day by day, as he fixed her fence, something else started to heal. Two people who'd forgotten how to hope began to remember what it felt like to care again. Could love really find you twice in one lifetime? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The jewelry box sat on Mabel's dresser like a monument to another life. Inside, Frank's wedding ring rested against faded velvet, 22 years of marriage, reduced to a simple gold band she couldn't bring herself to put away. 5 years had passed since the cattle stampede took him, but some mornings she still reached across the bed, expecting to find his warmth there. The Crane Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of Texas hill country, though sprawled might be generous these days. What once hummed with activity now bore the quiet marks of a woman doing the work of two. The barn doors hung slightly askew, paint peeling like old skin. The chicken coop needed new wire, and the windmill squeaked a lonely song that used to drive Frank crazy. Now it was just another voice in the symphony of things that needed fixing. Mabel had learned to live with the list. Every morning she'd pour coffee into Frank's old mug ceramic chipped at the rim where he'd dropped it that last morning and review what needed doing. The back fence had been on that list for months, sagging under the weight of years and weather. She'd meant to ask Jimmy Henderson from town to take a look, but asking for help felt like admitting defeat. Then came the storm. It rolled in just after midnight on a Tuesday. The kind of Texas weather that announces itself with thunder that shakes the windows and lightning that turns the sky white as bone. Mabel had always loved storms, the way they cleared the air and settled the dust. Frank used to tease her about standing on the porch during downpours, arms spread wide like she was conducting an orchestra of rain and wind. This storm had teeth. She woke to the sound of splintering wood and knew before she looked that the back fence was gone. In the grey dawn light, she could see the damaged 30 feet of posts and rails scattered like kindling, the gate hanging by one hinge like a broken wing. The sight of it made her chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with the humid air. For 3 days, she stared at the wreckage and told herself she could handle it. She had Frank's tools, his knowledge passed down through patient instruction during their married years. How hard could it be to replace a few fence posts? The first post took her 2 hours to pull from the ground. The second broke her favorite shovel. By the third, her hands were raw despite the work gloves, and her back ached in places she'd forgotten existed. She stood in the middle of the debris, covered in mud and defeat, and finally understood that some things were beyond her reach. The business card for Henderson's handyman service had been stuck to her refrigerator for 2 years, held in place by a magnet shaped like a cow. She'd never called, never needed to. But as she dialed the number that evening, pride felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. "Henderson's not available," the voice on the other end explained. "But I can send someone else. Boone McCready. He's good with fences." Mabel almost hung up. The idea of a stranger on her property, touching Frank's tools, working on Frank's land felt like betrayal. But the alternative was worse. She couldn't live with a broken fence, couldn't bear the daily reminder of her own limitations. "Send him," she said. Boone McCready arrived the next morning in a truck that had seen better decades. The Ford's blue paint had faded to grey in places, and the bed was loaded with tools that looked well used but cared for. He unfolded himself from the cab like he was made of spare parts all angles and height, with shoulders that seemed to have been built for carrying heavy things. Mabel watched from her kitchen window as he surveyed the damage. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned to measure twice and cut once. His grey hair was tucked under a worn cowboy hat, and his face had the kind of weathered look that came from years of outdoor work. When he knocked on her door, his knuckles were gentle against the wood. "Mrs. Crane, I'm Boone McCready. Come to look at your fence." His voice was soft, like he was talking to a spooked horse. Up close, she could see his eyes were the color of creek water, clear and steady. There was kindness there, and something else, recognition of loss that made her chest tighten. "It's a mess," she said, leading him to the backyard. "I tried to fix it myself, but—" "Sometimes the land has its own ideas about what needs doing," he said, examining the broken posts. This storm was something else, took down 3 fences on the Henderson place too. He worked in comfortable silence, measuring distances and testing the remaining posts for stability. Mabel found herself studying him from the porch, the way he moved with purpose but without hurry. When he bent to examine a section of wire, she noticed the tan line on his ring finger-pale skin where a wedding band once rested. "This'll take about a week to do right," he said when he finished his assessment. "Posts need to cure in the ground, and I won't rush good work." A week? The thought of someone else on her property for that long made her stomach flutter with something between anxiety and anticipation. "I can recommend someone else if that's too long," he said, misreading her hesitation. "Jimmy Henderson's booked solid, but there's a crew in Austin." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "I mean, a week is fine. How much?" He named a price that was fair but not cheap. They shook hands to seal the deal, and she was surprised by the calluses on his palm, the gentle firmness of his grip. When he left, she stood in her kitchen feeling oddly unsettled, like she'd just agreed to something more complicated than fence repair. That night, she took Frank's wedding ring from the jewelry box and held it up to the lamplight. The gold was smooth from years of wear, inscribed with their wedding date in tiny script. She thought about the stranger who would be working in her backyard, the quiet man with creek-water eyes who understood about loss. For the first time in 5 years, she wondered if she was ready for something new. The next morning she woke to find a thermos of coffee on her porch steps, still warm and with a note tucked underneath. "Thought you might need this. B." She stood on her porch in her robe, holding the thermos like it was something precious. The coffee was good strong, but not bitter, with a hint of cinnamon that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. In the distance, she could hear the sound of Boone's truck pulling into her driveway, the engine settling into quiet as he prepared for another day of work. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. The fence posts lay scattered in neat piles where Boone had sorted them, salvageable ones, separated from the broken, everything organized with the kind of methodical care that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. He'd brought his own tools, she noticed, though he'd asked permission to use Frank's wheelbarrow. The courtesy of it, the way he'd waited for her nod before touching anything, made something warm unfold in her chest. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a blue shirt that brought out her eyes instead of the usual faded work clothes, not because she was trying to impress anyone, she told herself, just because it was time to stop looking like a woman who'd given up on herself. When she carried a glass of water out to where Boone was working, she found him setting the first new post with the kind of precision that made the work look effortless. Sweat darkened his shirt, despite the morning cool, and she found herself noticing the way his muscles moved under the fabric. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, offering him the water. "That was thoughtful." He paused in his work, accepting the glass with a nod. "My wife used to say that coffee was the best way to start any conversation." Used to. Past tense. The words hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. "She sounds like a wise woman," Mabel said carefully. She was. He drank the water slowly, his eyes on the distant hills. Cancer took her 3 years ago, still getting used to mornings without her. The honesty of it, the way he offered his grief like a gift, made Mabel's throat tight. She understood about empty mornings, about the way silence could become its own presence in a house. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He nodded, handing back the empty glass. "Frank was your husband?" 22 years. Cattle stampede got him. She'd said those words hundreds of times, but never to someone who understood the weight of them. Some days I still set two places at the table. They stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned that grief was a conversation that never really ended. The morning sun climbed higher, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song. "I should let you work," she said finally. "Ma'am," he called her back as she reached the porch. "If you don't mind me saying, your husband did good work on this fence, built it to last." She smiled, the first real smile she'd given a stranger in years. He'd be pleased to hear that. As she went inside, she caught her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman, looking back at her, had color in her cheeks and something in her eyes that she'd almost forgotten, the faint, fragile beginning of hope. Frank's toolbox sat in the barn like a shrine to competence. Red metal dulled by years of use, each drawer organized with the precision of a man who believed there was a right tool for every job and a right place for every tool. Mabel had avoided opening it for months after the funeral, unable to bear the scent of machine oil and sawdust that clung to everything Frank had touched. Now she pulled it into the morning light, the metal handles worn smooth by his hands. The sight of his tool shammers and wrenches, arranged just as he'd left them, made her chest tighten with a familiar ache. But underneath the grief was something harder, determination. She would fix this fence herself. She had to. The post-hole digger felt foreign in her hands, heavier than she remembered from the few times Frank had let her help. The first hole should have been simple. The old post was already loosened by the storm, the ground soft from rain. But the digger bit into earth that seemed determined to fight back, and her shoulders burned with the effort of pulling up each scoop of mud and clay. By noon, she had managed one hole. One. The fence line stretched before her like an accusation, 30 feet of broken posts mocking her efforts. Her hands, soft from years of lighter work, had already begun to blister despite Frank's old leather gloves. "I can do this," she said aloud, her voice carrying across the empty pasture. "Frank taught me. I watched him do it 100 times." But watching and doing were different creatures entirely. The second post fought her like it was rooted in concrete, the digger slipping in her sweaty grip. When she finally wrestled it free, the hole was crooked, too narrow, nothing like the neat excavations Frank used to make with seemingly effortless strokes. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the Texas heat that made everything shimmer like a mirage. Mabel's shirt clung to her back, and salt burned her eyes. She paused to drink from the water bottle she'd brought out, looking at what she'd accomplished in 4 hours of back-breaking work, 2 holes, both wrong, and a growing pile of frustration. The third post broke her. Not the post itself, but something inside her that had been holding on by sheer will. The digger slipped from her blistered hands and fell with a dull clang. She sank to her knees in the mud, surrounded by Frank's scattered tools and her own inadequacy. "I can't," she whispered to the empty sky. "I can't do this." The words tasted like defeat, like admitting that 5 years of managing alone had been an illusion. Every leaky pipe she'd fixed, every loose board she'd nailed back into place, all of it, had been small repairs, temporary solutions. This was different. This required the kind of knowledge that came from decades of working with your hands, the muscle memory that Frank had built over a lifetime of ranching. She sat in the mud and cried for the first time since the funeral, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief. She cried for the fence, for Frank, for the woman she used to be when she had a partner to share the load. She cried for the mornings when she woke up expecting to find him beside her, and for the evenings when the silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. When the tears finally stopped, she felt hollow but strangely lighter. The fence was still broken, her hands still throbbed with fresh blisters, but something had shifted, like a fever breaking. She gathered Frank's tools with careful reverence, cleaning the mud from each piece before returning it to its proper place in the box. The post-hole digger went back to its hook on the barn wall, and she closed the doors on her failed attempt with something that felt almost like relief. Inside the house, she washed her hands at the kitchen sink, watching the muddy water swirl down the drain. Her palms were raw despite the gloves, and her back ached in places she'd forgotten existed. But the face, looking back at her from the window reflection, wasn't entirely defeated. It was the face of a woman who had tried, who had pushed herself to the limit, and found it. The business card for Henderson's handyman service was still stuck to her refrigerator, held in place by Frank's cow magnet. She'd looked at it a dozen times over the years, always finding a reason not to call. Too expensive, too proud, too afraid of letting strangers into the world she and Frank had built together. Now she picked up the phone with steady hands. "Henderson's handyman service," a cheerful voice answered. "This is Mabel Crane. I need someone to fix my fence." "Jimmy's booked solid for the next month," the woman explained. "But I've got Boone McCready available. He's done good work for folks out your way." Mabel closed her eyes, thinking of Frank's tools sitting unused in the barn, of the fence line that mocked her efforts. "What's he like?" "Boone. Oh, he's a good man. Quiet, does quality work. Lost his wife a few years back, so he understands about—" The woman caught herself. "Well, he's just good people. I can have him out tomorrow morning if you'd like." Lost his wife. The words hung in the air like a bridge between one kind of understanding and another. Maybe it would be easier to let someone fix her fence, if that someone knew about loss, about the way grief could make simple tasks feel impossible. "Tomorrow morning would be fine," Mabel said. She spent the evening preparing for a stranger's presence in ways that seemed important but impossible to explain. She cleaned the kitchen windows so she could watch him work. She made sure there was coffee in the house, the good kind she saved for special occasions. She even considered baking something, then caught herself and laughed at the absurdity of it. This was business, she reminded herself. A man was coming to fix her fence, nothing more. The fact that he understood about loss was convenient, not significant. The fact that she'd changed her sheets and chosen tomorrow's clothes with more care than usual was just, well, it was just being prepared. That night, she took Frank's wedding ring from the jewelry box and held it up to the lamplight. The inscription was almost worn away after 22 years, but she could still make out their wedding date if she squinted. She thought about the man who was coming tomorrow, the stranger who would see her in her everyday life, muddy and imperfect, and trying to hold things together. "I don't know what I'm doing, Frank," she said to the empty room, "but I can't keep pretending I can do everything alone." The ring caught the light and threw tiny reflections on the ceiling, like stars in a very small sky. She held it for a long time before placing it gently back in its velvet nest. Some things were meant to be kept safe, preserved exactly as they were. Other things, like fences, like hearts, sometimes needed fixing. She woke before dawn to the sound of an engine in her driveway. Through her bedroom window, she could see a man unloading tools from the back of a faded blue truck, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew his work. Even in the grey pre-dawn light, she could tell he was tall, built for the kind of labor that required both strength and patience. Boone McCready. The name had a solid sound to it, like something you could depend on. She dressed quickly, choosing the blue shirt that brought out her eyes, then caught herself in the mirror and wondered when she'd started caring about such things again. The woman looking back at her seemed nervous and hopeful in equal measure, like someone standing at the edge of something new. By the time she made coffee, the sun was beginning to paint the eastern hills with pale gold light. She could hear him working already, the sound of tools being arranged, of a man preparing to make something right that had been broken. When she carried the first cup out to him, she found him studying the fence line with the kind of attention Frank used to give to problems that mattered. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with grey hair tucked under a well-worn hat and eyes the colour of still water. "You must be Mrs. Crane," he said, accepting the coffee with hands that were scarred and gentle. "I'm Boone McCready, come to see about your fence." She nodded, suddenly shy in a way that made no sense. "It's quite a mess. I tried to fix it myself, but—" "Nothing wrong with trying," he said, and his voice was warm without judgment. "Sometimes the land has its own ideas about timing. This storm did some damage all through the county." As he walked the fence line, she found herself watching the way he moved, deliberate but not hurried, like a man who'd learned that rushing good work was a fool's errand. When he bent to examine a broken post, she noticed the pale band of skin on his ring finger where a wedding band used to rest. "This'll take about a week to do proper," he said when he finished his survey. "Posts need time to set, and I don't believe in shortcuts." A week. The thought of this quiet stranger working on her land for that long made something flutter in her chest that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't entirely comfortable either. "That sounds fine," she heard herself say. "When can you start?" "Today, if you're ready. I've got the posts curing in the truck." She nodded, feeling like she was agreeing to something larger than fence repair. As he went back to his truck to begin unloading, she stood in her yard and wondered what Frank would think of this momentous wife hiring another man to fix what he had built, to work the land they had shared. But Frank was gone, and the fence was broken, and sometimes the practical needs of the living had to come before the tender feelings of the grieving. She was 55 years old, and she was tired of doing everything alone. "Well then," she said to the morning air, "I guess we'll see what happens." Hidden between the pages of her grandmother's Bible, pressed flat as autumn leaves, were wildflowers that Mabel had forgotten she'd ever picked. She discovered them while dusting the bookshelf, tiny purple blooms and delicate white petals that crumbled at her touch. Once upon a time, she'd been the kind of woman who noticed beauty in small things, who stopped to gather flowers just because they were lovely. When had she stopped seeing such things? Through the kitchen window, she watched Boone work with the steady rhythm of a man who understood that some jobs couldn't be hurried. He'd arrived before sunrise again, unloading tools with the quiet efficiency of someone who respected the early morning peace. The thermos of coffee had appeared on her steps like a small miracle, still warm and perfectly spiced. She'd thanked him when she brought out his breakfast scrambled eggs and bacon on her grandmother's good china, because paper plates seemed wrong somehow. He'd accepted the meal with a nod that held more gratitude than flowery words could have conveyed. "You don't have to feed me," he'd said, but his eyes had softened when he tasted the eggs, seasoned with the herbs she grew in pots by the kitchen door. "I have to eat anyway," she'd replied, which wasn't entirely true. Most days, she barely managed coffee and toast, too lonely to make the effort of a real meal. Now she watched him dig post holes with a precision that made her own attempts look like child's play. Each excavation was perfectly straight, exactly the right depth, spaced with mathematical accuracy. The way he worked reminded her of Frank, but different. Where her husband had been quick and energetic, Boone was deliberate and thoughtful. The first day, they'd barely spoken beyond pleasantries. The second day, she'd lingered on the porch with her coffee, and he'd joined her during his break. They'd talked about the weather, the land, safe topics that didn't venture into deeper waters. But by the third day, something had shifted. "Your husband did good work on this original fence," Boone had said, examining one of the posts that had survived the storm. "Built it to last a lifetime." "He was good with his hands," Mabel had replied, then felt her cheeks warm at how that sounded. "I mean, he could fix anything." Boone had smiled, a small, understanding expression that made her realize he wasn't judging her words or her blush. "Takes skill to build something that stands up to Texas weather for 20 years. He knew his craft. The compliment to Frank had pleased her more than expected. Some of the neighbors had offered condolences after the funeral, but few had really known her husband's work, his quiet pride in doing things right. That this stranger could see Frank's craftsmanship and appreciate it felt like a gift. By the fourth day, she found herself timing her household chores to coincide with Boone's breaks. Not obviously, she wasn't some schoolgirl with a crush butt. If she happened to be sweeping the porch when he paused to drink water, well, that was just efficient planning. "You've got good soil here," he said, accepting the glass of iced tea she offered. "Rich and dark, must grow just about anything." Frank always said this land had good bones. She settled into the porch swing, leaving space between them that felt proper but not unfriendly. "We used to have a garden. Tomatoes, beans, squash. I let it go after well. It seemed like too much work for just one person. Boone nodded, understanding flickering in his creek water eyes. My Sarah loved to garden, had hands that could coax flowers from concrete. After she passed, I let everything go to weeds. Couldn't stand the sight of all that beauty when she wasn't there to see it. Sarah. The name hung between them like a bridge across their shared grief. Mabel found herself curious about this woman who had been loved by such a gentleman, who had tended gardens and made coffee with cinnamon. What was she like? The question slipped out before she could stop it, too personal for their careful acquaintance. Boone was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he smiled, and his whole face transformed. Stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something, laughed at her own jokes. Made the best apple pie in 3 counties, though she'd burn water if you weren't watching. He paused, his fingers absently turning the pale band where his wedding ring used to rest. She was sunshine on legs, my Sarah, made everything brighter just by being there. The love in his voice was so pure it made Mabel's chest ache. She recognized that Tone had heard it in her own voice when she spoke of Frank to well-meaning friends who asked how she was managing. "She sounds wonderful," Mabel said softly. She was. Died thinking I'd be lost without her, which wasn't wrong. He took a long drink of tea, his eyes on the distant hills. Took me near 3 years to figure out how to be in the world without her voice in my ear. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who understood that some losses couldn't be fixed, only carried. A mourning dove called from somewhere in the oak trees, its liquid song floating on the warm air. "Frank died thinking I was tougher than I am," Mabel found herself saying. "Always told people I could handle anything, his independent wife. I think he really believed it." "Maybe you are tougher than you think," Boone said. "Takes strength to keep going when the world feels empty." The words settled something in her chest that had been restless for years. Not the grief that would always be with her, but the worry that she was failing somehow, that Frank's confidence in her had been misplaced. "I should let you get back to work," she said, standing to collect his empty glass. "Mrs. Crane?" His voice stopped her at the door. "Would it be all right if I work a little late tonight? I'd like to get the corner post set before tomorrow's rain." She nodded, pleased by his thoughtfulness in asking permission to extend his time on her property. That evening, she found herself making extra dinner without quite planning to. Nothing fancy, just pot roast with vegetables, the kind of hearty meal that seemed right for a man who'd spent the day working with his hands. When she carried the plate out to him, she found him cleaning his tools with the same care he'd shown for everything else. The late afternoon light caught the silver in his hair, and she noticed laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who'd known happiness before he'd known loss. "You don't have to," he began. "I made too much," she said, which was becoming their comfortable fiction. "Seems a shame to waste it." They ate on the porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. The conversation came easier now, flowing between observations about the land and gentle questions about each other's lives. She learned that he'd grown up on a ranch in Oklahoma, that he'd met Sarah at a church social when they were both 19. He learned that she'd been a teacher before marrying Frank, that she missed the classroom but had never regretted choosing ranch life. As darkness settled over the hill country, Boone gathered his tools and loaded them into his truck. "Thank you for dinner," he said. "It's been a long time since I've had a home-cooked meal that good." After he left, Mabel sat on her porch swing and tried to remember the last time she'd enjoyed an evening so much. The fence posts stood straight and strong in the gathering dark, and for the first time in years, her ranch didn't feel quite so empty. Inside, she carefully pressed a small wildflower between the pages of her grandmother's Bible, next to the others that had waited there so long. Some things, she thought, were worth preserving. The unfinished scarf lay in Mabel's sewing basket, like a promise that had been forgotten. Blue wool, the color of winter sky, half completed in a cable pattern that had once seemed important enough to learn. She'd started it the Christmas before Frank died, intending it as a gift for their anniversary. The needles still held the last stitches she'd made, frozen in time like everything else that had mattered in those final months. She discovered it while looking for thread to mend a torn curtain, and the sight of it stopped her cold. When had she stopped creating things? When had her hands become useful only for maintenance and repair, never for the pure joy of making something beautiful? The fence was taking shape under Boone's patient labor, each post straight and solid, the wire strung with professional precision. They'd fallen into a rhythm over the past week, his early arrival with coffee, her breakfast offerings, shared breaks where conversation flowed like water, finding its natural course. "Tell me about your teaching," he'd said that morning, pausing in his work to accept the sandwich she'd brought him. "What grade did you teach?" "Third," she'd replied, settling beside him on the makeshift bench he'd fashioned from sawhorses and an old board. That wonderful age when they still think you know everything, but they're old enough to have real conversations. "Sarah always said she'd have liked to teach," he said, unwrapping the sandwich with careful hands. "Had a way with children, but we never—" He stopped, his jaw tightening slightly. "Never had your own?" Mabel asked gently. He shook his head. "Tried for years." Sarah blamed herself, though the doctors couldn't say for certain where the problem lay. She used to joke that God knew she'd spoil them rotten, so he was protecting the world from her indulgence. The pain in his voice was old but still sharp, like a scar that ached in cold weather. Mabel understood that particular hurt. She and Frank had wanted children too, had spent years hoping before finally accepting that it wouldn't happen for them. "Children would have been lucky to have her," Mabel said. "Both of you. What about you and Frank?" Same story, different ending. She watched a red-winged blackbird perch on the fence post he'd just installed. "We talked about adoption, but Frank was already 40 when we married, and I was 33. By the time we'd saved enough money and settled into the ranch, we'd made our peace with it being just us two." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the blackbird test the stability of Boone's work. The bird seemed satisfied, spreading its wings to show the bright scarlet patches before flying away. "This sandwich is excellent," Boone said finally. "What's that I'm tasting? Herbs? Sage from my garden. Well, what's left of it?" She gestured toward the overgrown patch near the kitchen door. "I used to keep herbs and vegetables, but it got away from me after Frank died." "Might be worth reclaiming," he said. "Sarah always said food tastes better when you've grown the seasonings yourself." That afternoon, while Boone worked on the corner posts, Mabel found herself standing in what had once been her pride and joy. The garden was a tangle of weeds and volunteer plants, but underneath the chaos, she could see the bones of what it had been. Tomato cages stood like skeletons among the wild growth, and the herb spiral Frank had built still held its shape, though sage and rosemary had grown into woody shrubs. She knelt in the dirt, pulling weeds with hands that remembered the feel of soil and growing things. The work was meditative, each cleared patch revealing some forgotten treasure, struggling basil plant, onions gone wild, mint that had taken over an entire corner. "Looks like good soil under all that tangle," Boone's voice said behind her. She looked up to find him watching her work, his own hands dirty from fence posts. "I'd forgotten how much I loved this," she said, brushing earth from a rescued oregano plant. "Frank used to say I had magic hands with growing things." "Hands remember," Boone said, crouching beside her to examine the herb spiral. "My grandfather built something like this. Said it created little climate, zone-shot and dry at the top for Mediterranean herbs, cool and moist at the bottom for the tender ones. Exactly what Frank said when he built it." She sat back on her heels, looking at the structure with new appreciation. "I thought it was complicated, but he said it was just paying attention to what each plant needed." They worked together as the afternoon light slanted golden across the garden, Boone pulling the larger weeds while Mabel sorted through what could be saved. Their conversation meandered like a lazy river, touching on gardening techniques, favorite herbs, the way certain smells could transport you to another time. "Sarah loved lemon balm," he said, freeing a struggling plant from a tangle of morning glory vines. "Made tea with it when she couldn't sleep. The whole house would smell like summer." "Frank was partial to basil," Mabel replied. "Said it made everything taste like Italy, though he'd never been farther from Texas than Oklahoma." As the sun began to set, they stood back to admire their work. The garden was far from restored, but the cleared patches looked hopeful, like promises waiting to be kept. "Thank you," Mabel said. "I couldn't have managed this alone." "Sometimes 2 sets of hands make light work," he replied, cleaning dirt from his fingers with the bandana from his pocket. "I enjoyed it. Been a long time since I worked in a garden." That evening, she invited him to stay for supper, not the careful offering of extra food, but a genuine invitation to share a meal. They ate at her kitchen table, the one that had felt too large for one person for so many years. The conversation flowed easily, touching on books they'd read, places they'd traveled, dreams they'd carried. "What would you do?" Boone asked over coffee. "If you could do anything at all, no practical considerations, no limitations." The question caught her off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her dreams rather than her needs. "Travel, maybe," she said slowly. "See the places Frank and I always talked about visiting. Ireland, where his grandparents came from. The gardens of England. Maybe take a cooking class in Italy." "What's stopping you?" "Oh, the usual things. Money, responsibilities, fear of traveling alone." She paused, considering. "Fear in general, I suppose. It's easier to stay where everything is familiar." "Fear's a poor advisor," he said gently. "Sarah used to say that to me when I'd hesitate over something new. Boone McCready, she'd say, fear's just excitement wearing a disguise." After he left, Mabel sat at her table with the unfinished scarf in her lap. Her fingers found the rhythm of the needles almost without thought, muscle memory guiding the wool through patterns her hands had learned years ago. The blue cable twisted and grew under her careful stitches, and for the first time in years, she was creating something beautiful just because she could. Outside, the fence posts stood straight and strong in the moonlight, and tomorrow Boone would return to continue his work. But tonight, she knitted and planned, thinking about gardens that could be reclaimed and dreams that might not be as impossible as they seemed. The antique music box had been silent for so long that Mabel had forgotten it could sing. She found it while cleaning out Frank's desk drawer, a delicate thing of mahogany and brass that had belonged to his grandmother. When she lifted the lid, expecting nothing, a cascade of silver notes filled the quiet room. Fur-elise played on tiny metal tines, each note pure and sweet as morning birdsong. The melody stopped her heart for a moment. She and Frank had danced to this song at their wedding reception, swaying together in the church basement while his grandmother smiled from her wheelchair. The music box had sat on their dresser for years, but she'd packed it away after Frank died, unable to bear the reminder of dancing, of music, of joy. Now the tune filled her kitchen like a benediction, and she found herself humming along, her body swaying slightly to the remembered rhythm. When had she stopped listening to music? When had silence become her constant companion? The fence was nearly finished. Boone had worked with quiet efficiency all week, and now only the gate remained to be hung. She could see him from the kitchen window, measuring and marking, his movements precise and unhurried. Tomorrow, maybe the day after, his work would be done, and he would drive away in his faded blue truck, leaving her with a solid fence and an empty yard. The thought made her chest tight, in a way that had nothing to do with the humid air. "Mrs. Crane." His voice carried across the yard, and she looked up to see him standing by the fence, wiping sweat from his forehead with his bandana. "Could I trouble you for some water?" She filled a pitcher with ice water and carried it out, along with 2 glasses and a plate of the oatmeal cookies she'd baked that morning. Not because she'd planned to bake, she'd simply woken with the urge to create something sweet, to fill her house with the scent of cinnamon and vanilla. "These smell like heaven," Boone said, accepting a glass of water and eyeing the cookies with the appreciation of a man who understood homemade goodness. "My grandmother's recipe," Mabel said, settling beside him on the porch steps. "I haven't made them in years, but I woke up thinking about them." He bit into a cookie and closed his eyes with the expression of a man tasting childhood. "These taste like my grandmother's too. Must be something universal about oatmeal and love." They sat in comfortable silence, sharing cookies and watching a red-tailed hawk circle high overhead. The morning was still cool, but heat shimmer was already beginning to rise from the distant hills. "I heard music coming from the house earlier," Boone said carefully. "Hope I didn't disturb anything." "Just an old music box," Mabel replied. "It belonged to Frank's grandmother. I'd forgotten how pretty it sounds." "Music's important," he said. "Sarah and I used to dance in the kitchen while she cooked dinner. Nothing fancy, just swaying to whatever was on the radio. I miss that almost more than anything else, the way music could turn an ordinary evening into something special." The longing in his voice made Mabel's heart ache. She tried to imagine this gentle giant of a man dancing with his beloved Sarah, twirling her around a kitchen filled with the sense of home cooking and laughter. "Frank wasn't much of a dancer," she said, "but he loved music. Used to play his guitar on the porch in the evenings, singing old country songs that made me cry, even when they were happy." "What happened to the guitar?" "It's in the closet," she admitted. "I couldn't stand to look at it for the longest time. Couldn't bear the silence of it." They finished their water and cookies as the sun climbed higher, painting the landscape in shades of gold and green. Boone returned to his work, and Mabel went inside to tackle the endless list of household chores that seemed to multiply when no one was watching. But she found herself distracted, humming the melody from the music box as she dusted and swept. When she passed Frank's guitar case in the hallway closet, she paused, her hand hovering over the worn leather handle. On impulse, she pulled it out and carried it to the living room. The guitar was beautiful, even under its layer of Duster Martin D28 that Frank had saved for 2 years to buy, back when they were newlyweds, and every purchase required careful consideration. She cleaned it with the soft cloth Frank had always used, remembering how he'd maintained it with the same care he gave everything he loved. When she strummed the strings, they were badly out of tune, but the wood still sang with that rich, warm tone that had filled so many evenings with music. She couldn't play, had never learned, despite Frank's gentle offers to teach. Herbert, holding the instrument, brought back memories of fireflies and front porch songs, of a time when their world had been full of simple pleasures. "That's a beautiful sound," Boone's voice said from the doorway. She looked up, suddenly self-conscious. "I can't play. I was just remembering," he said with understanding. "Mind if I?" He gestured toward the guitar. She handed it to him, curious. His large hands looked incongruous on the delicate instrument, but when he began to tune it, his touch was sure and gentle. The process took several minutes, his ear cocked to catch each note as he adjusted the tension. When he strummed the first chord, the sound that emerged was pure and true, filling the room with harmony. Without thinking, he began to play not a song she recognized, but something soft and sweet that seemed to flow from his fingertips like water. "I didn't know you played," Mabel said when the last note faded. "Learned as a boy," he said, running his thumb across the strings in a gentle cascade of sound. "My grandfather taught me. Said music was the closest thing to prayer a man could make with his hands. Frank used to say something similar. That music was how the heart spoke when words weren't enough." Boone played another song. This one she recognized, Blackbird by the Beatles, but slower, more contemplative than the original. His voice was rough but warm as he sang, and she found herself closing her eyes to listen. When the song ended, the house felt different somehow, not empty, but expectant, like a room waiting for a party to begin. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'd forgotten how much I missed hearing music in this house." "Would you?" he began, then stopped, looking uncertain. "There's a dance this Saturday night at the community center. Nothing fancy, just local folks and a small band. I was wondering if you might like to go." The invitation hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. A dance meant being seen together publicly, meant admitting that something was growing between them that was more than friendship. "I haven't danced in years," she said. "Neither have I," he replied, "but I remember how." She looked at this gentleman who had fixed her fence and shared her table, who had brought music back into her silent house. The thought of dancing with him, of moving together to music while the whole town watched, was both terrifying and wonderful. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. "I'd like that very much." His smile was like sunrise, warming her from the inside out. After he left that evening, she stood in her living room, holding Frank's guitar, humming the melody from the music box. Saturday was 3 days away. 3 days to remember how to be a woman who danced, who allowed herself to be courted, who believed in the possibility of joy. Frank's favorite flannel shirt hung in the closet like a ghost made of blue plaid and faded cotton. Mabel hadn't touched it since the funeral, couldn't bring herself to pack it away with the rest of his clothes that had gone to charity. It still smelled faintly of him sawdust and aftershave, and the indefinable scent that was purely Frank. Sometimes, on her loneliest nights, she would press her face into the soft fabric and try to remember what it felt like to be held. Now, 3 days before the community dance, she stood before her closet and wondered what it meant that she was thinking about dresses instead of flannel shirts, about dancing instead of mourning. "You're being foolish, Mabel Crane," she said to her reflection in the mirror. 55 years old and acting like a schoolgirl with her first beau. But the face looking back at her didn't look foolish. It looked alive in a way it hadn't for years, with color in her cheeks and something bright and hopeful in her eyes. She looked like a woman who had remembered how to anticipate joy. The fence was finished. Boone had hung the gate that morning, a sturdy thing that swung smooth and true on its hinges. He'd tested it several times, checking the latch and adjusting the tension until it closed with a satisfying click. The work was done, but he hadn't left. Instead, he'd lingered over coffee, helping her plan the restoration of her vegetable garden, discussing which herbs would thrive in the Texas heat. "The gate's a fine piece of work," she'd told him, as they stood admiring his craftsmanship. "Should last another 20 years if you keep it oiled," he'd replied, running his hand along the smooth wood. "Your husband built good foundations, made my job easier." She'd noticed how he always spoke of Frank with respect, never jealousy or competition. There was something deeply attractive about a man secure enough to honor another's memory without feeling threatened by it. That afternoon, she'd driven to town for the first time in weeks, needing to grocery shop and hoping to find something suitable to wear to the dance. The dress she'd worn to Frank's funeral was too somber, and her everyday clothes too casual. She needed something that said she was a woman, open to possibilities, not a widow frozen in grief. Main Street buzzed with the kind of gentle activity that made small towns feel like home. She waved to Martha Henderson at the bank, nodded to old Pete Jameson, sitting outside the hardware store. Everyone was friendly, but she caught the speculative looks, the way conversations paused when she passed. Word traveled fast in Dry Hollow, and by now everyone knew about the tall cowboy who'd been working on the Crane place. At Miller's department store, she found a dress the color of deep blue water, simple but elegant, with sleeves that would cover the work-roughened skin of her arms. When she held it up to herself in the mirror, she saw a woman who could dance, who could laugh, who could be courted by a good man. "That's a beautiful choice," said Betty Miller, appearing at her elbow with the practiced enthusiasm of a small-town shopkeeper. "You'll look lovely at the dance Saturday night." Mabel startled, realizing that her private hopes had somehow become public knowledge. "How did you—" "Honey, Boone McCready asked Charlie Weiss about the band schedule 3 times this week," Betty said with a knowing smile. "And Charlie told his wife, who told her sister, who told half the county. We're all just pleased as punch that you're getting out again." The warmth in Betty's voice was genuine, but Mabel felt heat rise in her cheeks anyway. The idea of being the subject of town gossip made her stomach flutter with anxiety. "People will talk," she said. "People always talk," Betty replied philosophically. "Question is whether they're talking because they're happy for you or because they've got nothing better to do. In your case, I'd say it's the former. You've been alone too long, Mabel. Frank wouldn't have wanted that for you." That evening, she tried on the dress and stood before her bedroom mirror, seeing herself as Boone might see her. The woman reflected there was older than she felt inside, with lines around her eyes and silver threading through her brown hair. But she was still herself, still the woman who had once danced in church basements and laughed until her sides ached. Her phone rang as she was hanging up the dress, her daughter's voice bright and familiar across the miles. "Mom, I was just thinking about you. How are you doing?" "I'm well, sweetheart," Mabel said, settling into the kitchen chair where she always took Jennifer's calls. "How are things in Houston?" They chatted about Jennifer's job, her husband's promotion, the children's school activities. It was Jennifer who finally broached the subject that had been dancing around the edges of their conversation. "Mrs. Henderson called Tom today," Jennifer said carefully. "She mentioned that you've had some work done on the fence." "The storm damaged it," Mabel replied, recognizing the careful tone her daughter used when she was fishing for information. "I hired someone to fix it. She said he's been there all week. It was a big job." A pause. "Mom, is there something you want to tell me?" Mabel closed her eyes, picturing her daughter's worried face. Jennifer had been Frank's little shadow growing up, and his death had hit her almost as hard as it had hit Mabel. The idea of her mother moving on might feel like a betrayal of the father she'd adored. "There might be," Mabel said quietly. "His name is Boone McCready. He's a good man, Jennifer, kind and respectful. He understands about loss." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you happy, Mom?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it cut through all of Mabel's uncertainty. "I think I might be," she said. "For the first time in years, I think I might be happy." "Then I'm glad," Jennifer said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "Daddy always said he wanted you to be happy, especially if something happened to him. He used to worry that you'd lock yourself away and forget how to live." After they hung up, Mabel sat in her kitchen thinking about Frank's wisdom, about the way he'd always been able to see further ahead than she could. He'd known her well enough to understand that grief might become a prison if she let it, that love unexpressed was love wasted. She walked to the closet and looked at his flannel shirt, hanging silent and still among her clothes. Slowly, carefully, she lifted it from its hanger and held it to her face one last time, breathing in the fading scent of the man who had loved her first and best. "I'll always love you, Frank," she whispered into the soft cotton, "but I think you'd want me to love again." She folded the shirt with reverent hands and placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of their bed, alongside his other treasure-issue's father's watch, their wedding album, the letters he'd written her during their brief courtship. These things would always be precious, but they didn't have to rule her life. Saturday was 2 days away. She had a new dress and a man who made her remember what it felt like to be desired. She had a daughter's blessing and a dead husband's imagined approval. She had music in her house again and hope in her heart. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The deed lay on Mabel's kitchen table like an accusation written on legal paper. Creased and yellowed with age, it bore Boone McCready's name in bold black ink, dated 3 months before the storm that had destroyed her fence. 3 months before he'd ever set foot on her property, before she'd known his name or the gentle way he took his coffee. She'd found it by accident, blown against her porch steps by the morning wind, escaped from a folder that had spilled from his truck when he'd reached for his toolbox. The papers had scattered across her yard like autumn leaves, and she'd gathered them without thinking, meaning only to return them. But the letterhead of the county clerk's office had caught her eye, and her own property description had made her look closer. The adjacent 40 acres, the land that bordered her ranch on the east, where the old Miller place had stood empty for years. Boone McCready had bought it in March. Had been planning something that involved her property line, her fence, her land. Her hands shook as she read the accompanying surveyor's report, the architect's drawings for a ranch house, the plans for expanded grazing that would require access to the county road access that ran directly through her property. "Mrs. Crane?" Boone's voice carried across the yard, and she looked up to see him walking toward the house, his face creased with concern. "I think some of my papers blew out of the truck." "You haven't seen." He stopped when he saw her face, when he noticed the deed spread before her on the table. For a moment, they stared at each other across the space that had become comfortable over the past week, across the growing trust that now felt fragile as spun glass. "You own the Miller place," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly, his creekwater eyes steady but wary. "Yes." "You bought it 3 months ago." Another nod. Before the storm, before my fence was damaged, before you ever met me. Boone took off his hat, running his fingers through his grey hair. Mabel, let me explain. Were you planning to ask me about an easement? She gestured to the papers with hands that trembled with something between anger and hurt. Is that what this has been about? The coffee, the meals, She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the intimacy that had been growing between them. No, his voice was firm, but she could see something that looked like panic in his eyes. It started that way, I won't lie to you. When I bought the Miller place, I knew I'd eventually need to talk to you about access to the road. But when the storm hit and Henderson called me about your fence, I thought it might be a way to meet you, to see what kind of neighbor you were. So you could charm me into giving you what you wanted. The words tasted bitter in her mouth. So I could see if we could work something out that would benefit both of us, he corrected. But that's not what happened, Mabel. That's not what this became. She stood up from the table, needing distance from him, from the papers that made her feel like a fool. What did it become, Boone? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a very calculated campaign to soften up the lonely widow. The hurt that flashed across his face was so genuine, it almost made her step back. Almost. It became something I never expected, he said quietly. It became the first time in 3 years that I've wanted to wake up in the morning. It became falling in love with a woman who makes me remember what it feels like to be whole. How convenient, she said, but her voice cracked on the words. Fall in love with the woman who owns the land you need. Mabel, please, let me show you the plans. You'll see that I never intended. I don't want to see your plans. She gathered the papers with sharp, efficient movements, her teacher's instincts for maintaining control taking over. I want you to leave. Not like this. He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. Not when you're hurt and angry and not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in weeks, she said, thrusting the papers toward him. Take these and go. Send me a bill for the fence work. He didn't move to take the papers. What about the dance? The question hit her like a physical blow. The dance. The new dress hanging in her closet, the anticipation that had been building all week, the image of herself in his arms, moving to music while the whole town watched. It felt like ashes now, like a dream that had turned into a nightmare upon waking. There is no dance, she said. Not for us. Boone stood in her kitchen for a long moment, his hat in his hands, his face a map of regret and something that looked like genuine anguish. Then he reached out slowly and took the papers from her trembling fingers. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorrier than you'll ever know, not for buying the land that was business, but for not telling you sooner. For letting you think, for letting this happen, without being honest about how it started. She couldn't speak, couldn't trust her voice not to break completely. I meant what I said, he continued. About falling in love with you. That was never part of any plan. That was grace, Mabel, something I thought I'd never have again. After he left, she sat at her kitchen table and stared at the space where the deed had been. The new fence stood straight and strong beyond her window, every post perfect, every wire taut. Beautiful work done by skilled hands, work that had been meant to impress her, to earn her trust, to make her amenable to whatever proposal he'd been planning to make. The music box sat on the counter where she'd left it that morning, its lid open but silent. She walked over and closed it with a sharp click, shutting away the melody that had made her remember how to dance. The phone rang twice that afternoon. Friends calling to chat about the dance, to ask what she was wearing, to share the town's excitement about seeing her out with Boone McCready. She let the machine answer, couldn't bear to explain that there would be no dancing, no public debut of her tentative return to happiness. That evening, she took the blue dress from her closet and laid it on the bed, smoothing the fabric with gentle hands. It was beautiful, the kind of dress that made a woman feel special, desired, worthy of courtship. She'd been so looking forward to wearing it, to seeing herself reflected in Boone's eyes as they moved together across the dance floor. Now it just looked like evidence of her own foolishness. She called Jennifer that night, needing to hear a voice that loved her unconditionally. "Mom, you sound upset. What's wrong?" "I made a mistake," Mabel said. And then the whole story came pouring out the fence, the growing friendship, the attraction that had bloomed into something deeper. And finally, the papers that had changed everything. "Oh, Mom," Jennifer said when she finished, "I'm so sorry. But are you sure you're not being too hard on him? I mean, he did tell you the truth when you found out." "After I found out," Mabel corrected. "He would never have told me if I hadn't seen those papers." Maybe. Or maybe he was trying to find the right way to explain something complicated. Love usually is complicated, isn't it? Mabel closed her eyes, remembering the look on Boone's face when she'd accused him of using her. The hurt there had seemed so real, so deep. But then, a man who could plan such an elaborate deception was probably skilled at showing whatever emotion served his purpose. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said. "Then maybe you should take some time," Jennifer suggested. "Don't make any permanent decisions while you're hurt and angry. Give yourself a chance to think it through when your heart's not so raw." After they hung up, Mabel walked through her house, touching the things that had become familiar again: the music box, Frank's guitar, the knitting needles that had found their rhythm once more. Everything felt different now, tainted by the knowledge that she'd been played for a fool by a man who'd seemed too good to be true. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? The oldest story in the book, the vulnerable widow, taken in by a charming stranger who had an agenda all along. She should have known better, should have remembered that men like Boone McCready didn't just appear in women's lives without reason. Outside, the fence stood strong in the moonlight, and she had to admit it was beautiful work. Whatever his motives, Boone had done exactly what he'd promised, given her a fence that would last 20 years. The gate swung smooth and true, the posts were straight and solid, and every wire was strung with professional precision. It was just her heart that felt broken beyond repair. The letters were hidden in the bottom drawer of Frank's old desk, beneath insurance papers and tax returns that Mabel hadn't touched in years. She'd been looking for their property deed, needing to verify the exact boundaries after Boone's revelation, when her fingers found the manila envelope with her name written across it in Boone's careful script. Inside were letters, dozens of them, dated but never sent, each one written on the letterhead of a hotel in the next county. The earliest was dated 6 months ago, just after he'd bought the Miller place. The latest was from 3 days ago, the night before she'd found the deed. Her hands trembled as she read the first one. "Dear Mrs. Crane, my name is Boone McCready, and I recently purchased the property adjacent to yours. I'm writing to introduce myself and to discuss a matter of mutual interest regarding access to the county road. I realize this is an unusual way to approach a neighbor, but I wanted to put my thoughts in writing before we met." The letter went on for 2 pages, outlining his plans for the property, his need for an easement, his willingness to compensate her fairly for the inconvenience. It was businesslike, respectful, the kind of correspondence any reasonable person might write to a neighbor. But he'd never sent it. The second letter was dated a month later, after what he described as driving past your place several times, trying to work up the courage to knock on your door. "I keep telling myself this is business, but the truth is I'm nervous about meeting you. Sarah always said I was too direct for my own good, but now I find myself overthinking every word. Maybe it's because I can see from the road how well you maintain your property, how much care you take with what was clearly built by loving hands. I don't want to be just another person who wants something from you." This letter was more personal, filled with observations about her garden, her well-maintained buildings, the way she'd hung laundry on the line in patterns that suggested someone who took pride in small details. It was the letter of a man who'd been watching her, not in any sinister way, but with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested in who she was as a person. But he'd never sent this one either. The letters continued chronologically, each one a window into Boone's growing internal conflict between business necessity and personal interest. By the 4th month, he was writing about his wife Sarah, about his own loneliness, about the way grief could make even simple decisions feel overwhelming. I hired a lawyer to draft a formal easement proposal, but when I read it, all I could think was how cold it sounded. How it reduced what might be a neighborly arrangement to legal language and property lines. Sarah would have walked over with a pie and a smile, made friends first and worried about business later. I've never had her gift for connecting with people. The most recent letters were devastating in their honesty. He wrote about seeing her work in her garden, about the way she moved with purpose even when she was alone. He wrote about his own shame at using the fence repair as an excuse to meet her, and his growing realization that his feelings had become something far more complicated than neighborly interest. I know I should tell you about the property, about why I originally wanted to meet you, but every day that passes makes it harder. How do you explain to someone that what started as business has become the most important thing in your life? How do you say that you were planning to ask for an easement, but now you'd give up the whole property just to keep sharing coffee on her porch? I'm in love with you, Mabel. I know I have no right to those feelings. Know that the way this started makes me unworthy of them. But Sarah used to say that love doesn't ask permission. It just arrives and changes everything. I wish I was brave enough to tell you all of this in person. I wish I was the kind of man who deserved someone like you. The last letter was dated 3 days ago, the night before she'd found the deed. Tomorrow, I'm going to tell you everything, about the property, about the easement, about how this all started. I can't live with the deception anymore, can't build something real on a foundation of half-truths. I know you might hate me. I know you might never forgive me for not being honest from the beginning. But I love you too much to keep lying, even by omission. If you never want to see me again after tomorrow, I'll understand. I'll find another way to access my property, or I'll sell it and move away. But I had to take the chance that you might understand, that what we've found together might be strong enough to survive the truth about how it began. I love you, Mabel Crane. Whatever happens tomorrow, that will always be true. She sat at Frank's desk with tears streaming down her face, surrounded by the evidence of a good man's struggle with an impossible situation. These weren't the letters of someone playing an elaborate game. They were the thoughts of a man who'd been tormented by his own deception, who'd fallen in love despite his best intentions, who'd been trying to find the courage to tell her the truth, and she'd driven him away before he could. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Martha Henderson, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "Mabel, honey, I just wanted to check on you. Boone McCready was in here this morning closing out his account, and he looked like death warmed over. Said he was leaving town, maybe going back to Oklahoma. I thought you two were well, we all thought." "Leaving?" Mabel's voice came out as a croak. "This afternoon, from what I heard. Jimmy saw him loading his truck. Look, I don't know what happened between you two, but that man's been nothing but respectful and kind since he came to town. Whatever the quarrel was about, maybe it's worth working through." After Martha hung up, Mabel sat in the gathering dusk and tried to process what she'd learned. Boone was leaving, running away from the mess he'd created, or maybe just giving her the space she'd demanded. Either way, if she didn't do something soon, he'd be gone, and this chance, however complicated and messy, would be lost forever. She thought about the letters, about the man who'd written them. Not the scheming manipulator she'd imagined, but someone as lost and lonely as she'd been. Someone who'd made a mistake in how he'd approached her, but whose feelings had been genuine from the moment they'd met. She thought about Frank, about what he would have wanted for her. He'd been a practical man, someone who judged people by their actions rather than their words. What would he make of a man who'd worked with such care on their fence, who'd helped restore her garden, who'd brought music back into their house? What would he think of someone who'd written dozens of letters trying to find the right words, the right way to be honest about a complicated situation? The blue dress still hung in her closet, unworn and full of possibility. The community dance was tomorrow night, and the whole town would be there. If she was going to make a grand gesture, if she was going to fight for something that might be worth saving, that would be the place to do it. But first, she had to find Boone, had to look him in the eye and tell him she'd read his letters, that she understood the difference between deception and a good man making bad choices. Had to find out if there was still time to salvage something real from the ruins of their broken trust. She drove to the Miller place as the sun was setting, her heart hammering against her ribs. His truck was there, loaded with boxes and furniture, looking like a life being packed away. The sight of it made her chest tight with something that felt like panic. She found him sitting on the porch of the old farmhouse, staring out at the land he'd bought with such hope, and was now apparently abandoning. When he saw her truck pull up, he stood slowly, his face carefully neutral. "Mabel." Her name sounded like a prayer and a goodbye all at once. "I found your letters," she said, walking toward him with the manila envelope in her hands. All of them. Something that looked like relief and terror crossed his face. "I never meant for you to see those." "Maybe not, but I'm glad I did." She stopped a few feet away from him, close enough to see the pain in his creek, water eyes. "They tell a different story than the one I imagined." "They tell the truth," he said quietly. "The truth I should have had the courage to tell you from the beginning." "And what truth is that?" He looked at her for a long moment, as if memorizing her face. "That I bought this land for practical reasons, yes. That I knew I'd need to talk to you about access. But that the moment I met you, everything changed. That I fell in love with your strength, your independence, your kindness. That every day I didn't tell you about the property made me feel smaller, but also made the thought of losing you more unbearable. And now I'm leaving like you asked, selling the land and going back to Oklahoma where I can't do any more damage to either of us." She looked at this good man who'd made an understandable mistake and was now preparing to sacrifice everything to give her what she'd said she wanted. The letters in her hands were proof of his struggle, evidence of a conscience that had been eating at him for months. "What if I don't want you to go?" she asked softly. Hope flickered in his eyes like candlelight in wind. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that good men sometimes make bad choices for good reasons. I'm saying that love is complicated and messy and hardly ever starts the way it should." She took a step closer. "I'm saying that there's a dance tomorrow night, and I have a new dress, and I'd like to go with the man I've fallen in love with, even knowing how it started. Especially knowing how it started. Because your letters show me who you really are, Boone McCready, and that's a man worth dancing with." The new fence gate stood between their properties like a doorway to possibility. Boone had carved their initials into the top rail knot boldly, but with the subtle artistry of a man who worked with his hands and understood that some things were meant to last. MC and BM intertwined in a simple design that looked like it had always been there. Mabel discovered it the morning after their reconciliation, when she'd walked over to help him unload the boxes he'd packed in haste and desperation. The sight of those initials made her chest tight with emotion. He'd carved them before everything went wrong, back when he'd still been hoping they had a future together. "You found it," Boone said, coming up behind her with 2 cups of coffee, his voice soft with something between pride and embarrassment. "When did you do this?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "The day before you found the deed," he admitted. "I was planning to show you that evening, after I told you about the property. Thought it might help explain how I felt about us having a future together." She turned to face him, seeing the uncertainty in his creek water eyes. Even after yesterday's conversation, after her declaration that she wanted to attend the dance with him, he was still afraid. Still worried that her forgiveness might be temporary, that she might change her mind when the reality of their complicated beginning set in. "It's beautiful," she said, accepting the coffee and letting her fingers brush his. "But are you sure you want your initials permanently linked to mine? People will talk." "People always talk," he said, echoing Betty Miller's words from the dress shop. "Question is whether we care more about their opinions or our own happiness." The truth was, Mabel was surprised by how little she cared about gossip. The woman who'd spent 5 years carefully maintaining her reputation as the self-sufficient widow was discovering that love made such concerns seem trivial. What mattered was the man standing beside her, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. The way he'd spent months writing letters he'd never sent because he was afraid of losing something he wasn't sure he deserved. They spent the morning working together to unpack his belongings, carrying boxes into the farmhouse he'd been renovating with careful attention to its original character. The house was smaller than hers, but beautifully proportioned, with wide plank floors and windows that framed views of rolling hills. He'd been working on it slowly, doing the kind of meticulous restoration that honored the builders who'd come before. Sarah would have loved this kitchen, he said, running his hand along the cabinet he'd crafted to match the original 1920s design. She always said old houses had better bones than new ones. She was right, Mabel said, admiring the way he'd managed to install modern conveniences without destroying the home's historic charm. You've done beautiful work here. As they worked, she began to understand the scope of what he'd been planning. Not just a house, but a life, a place where he could raise a few head of cattle, maybe some horses. A workshop where he could pursue the furniture making that had been his hobby during his marriage to Sarah. A home where he could start over, build something new from the ashes of his grief. And he'd wanted her to be part of it. The evidence was everywhere: in the garden space he'd planned with herbs and vegetables, in the porch swing built for two, in the way he'd oriented the house to take advantage of views that included her property. He'd been dreaming of a shared life, imagining mornings when they'd drink coffee together while watching the sunrise paint the hills gold. "The dance starts at 7, she said, as they finished arranging the last of his books on the shelves he'd built into the living room alcove. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, and she could hear the worry beneath his casual tone. "About the dance?" "No." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes. "About us?" "Not anymore." He set down the book he'd been holding and reached for her hands, his calloused fingers gentle against her work-roughened skin. "I love you, Mabel Crane. I know the way this started was all wrong, but what I feel for you, that's the most right thing in my life." "I love you too," she said, and watched his face transform with relief and joy. "Despite your terrible timing and your cowardly letter-writing habits." He laughed, the sound rich and warm in the quiet house. "My letter-writing habits? Dozens of letters and you never sent a single one. That's not communication, Boone McCready. That's just very elaborate procrastination." "I'll work on it," he promised, pulling her closer. "Though I have to say, talking to you in person is much more satisfying than writing letters." Through the kitchen window, she could see the gate he'd built between their properties, the carved initials catching the afternoon light. Tomorrow, she'd need to think about practical things show. They'd merge their lives, their properties, their carefully constructed routines. But tonight, there was dancing. "We should probably get ready," she said, though she made no move to step away from him. "Probably," he agreed, but his arms tightened around her waist. The dance was hours away, but already she could feel the music beginning, not the band that would play at the community center, but the deeper rhythm of two hearts learning to beat in time together. The photograph was Boone's idea, suggested by Martha Henderson as they stood together in the community center, watching the other couples sway to the band's gentle version of Tennessee Waltz. It would be their first picture together. He said something to mark the beginning of whatever they were building together. "Are you sure?" Mabel asked, smoothing the skirt of her blue dress. "Once it's taken, the whole county will know we're officially a couple." "I'm sure," he said, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "Question is, are you?" She looked around the community center, decorated with crepe paper streamers and mason jars filled with wildflowers. Half the town was there, faces she'd known for decades, watching with the benevolent curiosity that small communities reserved for their own. Betty Miller waved from across the room, clearly delighted to see Mabel wearing the dress she'd helped choose. Martha Henderson was practically beaming, taking credit for bringing them together through the fence repair referral. "I'm sure," Mabel said, and discovered she meant it completely. The photographer, young Tommy Weiss, home from college and earning money with his camera, positioned them by the decorative arch someone had built from hay bales and autumn flowers. Boone's arms circled her waist with comfortable possession, and she found herself leaning into his solid warmth without conscious thought. "Smile like you're happy," Tommy instructed, though Mabel could hear the grin in his voice. "Shouldn't be too hard considering." The flash popped, preserving the moment in silver and light. When Mabel blinked away the spots in her vision, she saw Boone looking down at her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch. "Mrs. Crane? Mr. McCready?" Tommy was already moving to the next couple, but he called back over his shoulder. "That was a good one. You'll want copies." They danced for hours, moving together with surprising grace for two people who'd claimed to be out of practice. Boone led with gentle confidence, his large hands careful with her smaller ones, guiding her through turns and spins that made her dress flare out like blue water. "You're a good dancer," she said during a slow song that let them move closer together. "You make it easy," he replied, his breath warm against her ear. "Sarah used to say dancing was just walking to music with someone you cared about. She sounds like she was full of wisdom." "She was. I think she would have liked you." He pulled back to look at her face. "I think she would have been glad I found someone who makes me remember how to be happy." The song ended, but they stayed in each other's arms for a moment longer, surrounded by the gentle chaos of a small-town dance. Children ran between the tables while their parents visited with neighbors. Elderly couples moved with the careful grace of long partnership. Young people laughed and flirted with the earnestness that only comes with first love. This was their world, Mabel realized. These were their people, their community, the folks who would watch them build a life together and offer opinions whether asked for or not. It felt right to be here with Boone, to let themselves be seen as a couple, to take their place among the other pairs who'd found each other and chosen to stay together. "I should mention something," Boone said as they made their way back to their table. "I've been thinking about the easement situation." "Oh?" Mabel settled into her chair, curious about his tone. "I don't need it," he said simply. "I've been talking to the county about extending the Miller Place access road. It'll cost more and take longer, but it means I won't need to cross your property at all." She stared at him, processing what he was saying. "But that was the whole reason you wanted to meet me in the first place." "It was one reason," he corrected, "but not the only one anymore. I won't have our relationship tangled up with business arrangements and legal complications. What we have should be separate from all that." "Boone, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "I need to know that whatever happens between us is because we want to be together, not because we're convenient neighbors with compatible property needs." The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly designed to address her deepest concerns about their beginning, that she felt tears prick her eyes. This was the kind of man Boone McCready was, someone who would sacrifice convenience and money to preserve the integrity of their relationship. "You're going to make me cry," she warned. "Can't have that," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Not when you look so beautiful in that dress. Mr. McCready, you're quite the charmer." "Just honest, Mrs. Crane. Though I have to say, I'm looking forward to the day when you might consider changing that name." The suggestion hung in the air between them, bold and hopeful and terrifying in its implications. Marriage. The word he hadn't said, but that colored everything he had said. The possibility of becoming Mrs. McCready, of officially blending their lives and properties and futures. "That's quite a suggestion for a second date," she said, though her heart was racing. "Third, if you count the fence consultation," he said with a grin. "But you're right. I'm getting ahead of myself. I just wanted you to know that's where my thoughts are heading." "Good to know," she said softly. "Good to know where we're both heading." The porch swing had been Boone's wedding gift to himself and to Mabel, though they'd been married for only 3 weeks and were still getting used to the idea of we instead of I and you. Built from the same oak he'd used for her fence. It hung from chains. He'd forged himself in the workshop behind his house. Their house now, though some mornings she still woke surprised to find him beside her, solid and warm and real. 6 months had passed since the storm that brought him into her life, and the seasons had turned from late summer to autumn to the gentle warmth of a Texas spring. The timing felt right somehow, their love blooming alongside the wild flowers that painted the hills in brilliant colors, as if the land itself was celebrating their second chance at happiness. "Coffee's ready," Boone called from the kitchen, and Mabel smiled at the familiar ritual. They'd combined households with surprising ease, his practical furniture blending with her sentimental pieces, his morning routine adapting to her preference for watching the sunrise from the east-facing porch. She found him standing at the stove, spatula in hand, grey hair rumpled from sleep. The sight of him making breakfast in their kitchen, her grandmother's china, set beside his sturdy ceramic mug still, filled her with quiet wonder. This was marriage at 55 and 60, comfortable, grateful, seasoned by loss but not diminished by it. "Pancakes?" she asked, peering over his shoulder at the golden circles bubbling in the cast-iron skillet. "Your grandmother's recipe," he said, flipping one with the confidence of a man who'd been practicing. "Though I still can't get them as light as yours." "Practice makes perfect," she said, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. He was still tall enough that she had to stand on her toes to rest her chin on his shoulder, but that just made the embrace feel more intentional. They ate on the new porch swing, plates balanced on their laps, watching the morning light creep across the pasture where Boone's small herd of cattle grazed alongside the horses. They'd bought together gentle animals, suitable for trail rides and afternoon adventures. "Jennifer called yesterday," Mabel said, cutting her pancakes into neat squares the way she'd done since childhood. "She and the kids want to visit next month." "Looking forward to meeting them properly," Boone replied, "though I suspect her husband still thinks I'm some kind of fortune hunter. Tom's protective, that's all. He'll come around once he sees how happy you make me." She leaned against Boone's shoulder, solid and warm in the morning cool. "The kids are excited about learning to ride. Jennifer says Emma's been practicing her cowgirl voice." They'd video called with her grandchildren several times, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Jake, treating Boone with the careful politeness children reserved for new adults in their orbit. But there'd been genuine curiosity too, especially when he'd shown them his workshop and the rocking horse he was carving for their visit. "Speaking of visitors," Boone said, "my brother called. He and Linda want to drive down from Oklahoma next weekend. Fair warning, he's going to want to inspect you thoroughly and probably ask inappropriate questions about your intentions." "My intentions?" Mabel laughed. "I'm the one who married above her station. You're the one with the woodworking skills and the ability to fix anything that breaks. You're the one with the teacher's pension and the land that's been in your family for 3 generations. He countered. "Plus you can cook, which puts you well ahead in the practical marriage department." It was an old, comfortable argument, this gentle competition over who was luckier in their union. The truth was, they both knew they'd found something rarer, love built on friendship, seasoned by experience, sweetened by the knowledge of how precious and fragile happiness could be. The gate between their properties stood open now, the path between the 2 houses, worn smooth by their daily passage back and forth. They'd kept both homes, using his for the workshop and guest quarters, hers for daily living. It wasn't the most efficient arrangement, but it honored their individual histories while creating space for their shared future. "I was thinking," Boone said, setting down his empty plate and reaching for her hand, "about that garden expansion you've been planning. What about it? Maybe we should add a greenhouse, something we could use year-round, grow herbs and vegetables even in winter. I could build it myself, design it to match the style of the house." She studied his face, seeing the excitement there, the pleasure he took in planning projects they could work on together. "That's a wonderful idea. Though you know I'll want to help with the construction. Wouldn't dream of doing it without you," he said, bringing her hand to his lips to press a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Partners in all things, right?" "Partners in all things," she agreed. A red-winged blackbird landed on the fence post nearest the swing, the same species that had tested Boone's workmanship that first week. This one seemed equally satisfied with the craftsmanship, spreading its wings to display the brilliant scarlet patches before settling in for what appeared to be a long visit. "Think he approves?" Boone asked. "I think we all approve," Mabel said, leaning into her husband's warmth as the swing moved gently back and forth. I think we've all found exactly what we needed. The morning stretched ahead of them, full of small tasks and gentle pleasure tending the garden, working on their individual projects, sharing meals and conversation and the comfortable silences that came with deep contentment. Tonight, there would be another sunset from this same swing, another chance to count their blessings and plan for tomorrow. It wasn't the life either of them had expected to find at this stage, but it was better than anything they'd dared to hope for. Love had found them twice, in different seasons, wearing different faces, but offering the same essential gift, the chance to be known completely and cherished anyway. The swing moved in its gentle arc, and Mabel closed her eyes to better feel the morning sun on her face, the steady rhythm of Boon's breathing, the profound peace of being exactly where she belonged. Some storms destroyed things that couldn't be repaired, but sometimes, if you were very lucky, they brought exactly what you needed to build something even better than what came before.